a lot of time in the back of the room because they're trying to tape this, and my understanding is that it will pick it up better over there, and you actually want to look at the slides, not me, so that's good. One of the things that is really important is Laura just told you a story. She told you a story about Osseo. That is a story that's replicated in 341 school districts in this state. So it is not something that is just Osseo-centered. What we came about when we started was finding out that there were these kinds of issues that were occurring in every school, be you rural, suburban, or urban. And that got us thinking, maybe there's something larger going on that we should learn about. And then we should get that information out to parents all across the state. And my goal early on was to make sure that we had advocates in all 134 legislative districts in the state, and we do. We've had that for 5 years. And every Friday, no matter what, we put out a legislative update that tells you this week, this is what the legislature's thinking about and its impact on our schools. We learned very early on that if you truly want to make impact at your local schools, one of the things you have to understand is the relationship between state and federal policy and the impact they have on your schools. Because it's growing, it's growing, it's growing. Between testing and funding and policies on teachers, it is astonishing. So that's one of the things we do. But we cut our teeth on funding and we cut our teeth on levies. So this presentation that I'm giving you today in some way, shape, or form has been done over 400 times in the state of Minnesota in front of groups just like you who say, I don't quite understand it. First and foremost, you'll hear that there are 5 people in the state that can explain to you how schools are funded. I find that very diminishing. I think we're pretty smart people. And I think if you give us time, we can pretty much figure it out. So that's what we're attempting to do. So this is literally School Funding 101. And because I think it's really important for you to understand who is speaking at any given time to you, I think it's important for you to know who we are. Parents United is a Minnesota-born organization 10 years ago. We are a parent-led organization. All our board members are parents and grandparents. We are grassroots. We don't take positions. We try and help parents understand the relationship. We're an organization that's committed to Minnesota's leadership in quality E16 public education. It needs to be a continuum. Parents do not chunk their children. They don't say, I'm done with preschool, that's it, K-12. We understand the need for the continuum, and we believe as parents we can make that point. It's important to understand that education is a constitutional mandate. Most people don't get that. It is the only constitutional mandate the state of Minnesota has. And that is, it is the duty of the legislature to establish a general and uniform system of public schools through taxation or otherwise. It is their job. So when people tell you it's the largest part of the state budget, yes, because it is your only mandate. There's a secondary mandate that makes them take care of trunk lines for interstate highway. So when you're coming along on 94 and all of a sudden you hit Minnesota from Wisconsin, you don't run into Pothole Central. Some would argue that we already do, but at any rate, that's their only other mandate. That's important. That mandate makes it incredibly essential for us to know that this has to be for every single student. Now, they've upped the odds with No Child Left Behind and a lot of statute that's come through. It is 100% of our kids. 100%, not 99, 100%. There are requirements in Minnesota that are different than other states. It is actually, in Minnesota, education is a fundamental right. This came off a lawsuit, the Cecconi lawsuit, that was resolved in 1993. As a fundamental right, that makes it a civil right in Minnesota for a child to have an education. Their decision, this is the Supreme Court's actual decision, requires the state to provide enough funds to ensure that each student receives an adequate education and that funds are distributed in a uniform manner. When this lawsuit was resolved and this Supreme Court decision was made, there were no academic standards in the state of Minnesota along with MCAs and proficiency marks. So determining adequate education and adequate funding was more difficult. Today, schools are told, these are your academic standards, these are the proficiency rates you need to match. Our argument is, you set the standard state, you set the proficiency rate state, you set the resource state. They should be aligned according to the Supreme Court and our Constitution. This is why the state actually is to provide and does provide the lion's share of district funding. This is the part that 5 people can explain to you. There's a basic pupil formula set by, notice who? The state legislature. Not your school board, not your superintendent, not your principal. The state legislature. That times AMQ, the adjusted marginal cost pupil unit, that's your child. You took the time to name them John or Jane, but to the state they're AMQ. So this funding formula times AMQ, lo and behold, gives districts their operating funds. These are the ones that are actually flexibly used. There are other dollars that can be used, but they're categorical. You must use these money for children who qualify for free and reduced lunch. You must use these dollars for integration. You must use these dollars for special education. These are the dollars that actually are the ones that deal with teachers and class size and how to make that happen. Now, one would think that's very easy. It is. Well, then the state decided to add another level on this. They take the basic pupil formula and they have it times an indicator. As kindergartners, you don't get 1 times the per pupil formula. You get 0.61 times the per pupil formula. The logic behind that was all kids go to half-day kindergarten, don't they? Well, 54% of our kids in our state go to full-day kindergarten, but they are funded at 0.612. We're already behind the 8 ball. If you're in grade 1 to 3, you get funded 1.115 times the per pupil formula. Grades 4 to 6, 1.06 times the pupil formula. And grades 7 to 12, 1.3 times the per pupil formula. I put that up there because I think it's interesting. Notice no one qualifies for 1 times the per pupil formula. Maybe that should tell us something about that per pupil formula. The current basic formula is $5,224. Now, this is a slide that I think is really interesting because this slide was done by the Minnesota Department of Education. And in all of the years that I've been watching this, in Minnesota it's been 20 years, I've never seen the Minnesota Department of Education put a slide out that says this. What this slide says is if you take out all those local levies, and you actually assume that there is inflation, and in the last 10 years, the inflation rate has been 3.1% every year, then actually that per pupil formula should be much higher than it is. And what this says is actually what we spend in schools going into 2013 is what schools had in 2003. I've never seen that. This is the other way it looks. No matter what school district you are in, you have less today than you had then. Minneapolis-St. Paul, 15% less. Metro Inner Ring, 9.7% less. Outer Ring, 13% less. Non-Metro, greater than 2,000, 14% less. Non-Metro 1 to 2,000, 15% less. Non-Metro greater than 1,000, 14%. Charter schools, 14% less. No matter how you slice and dice and cut this thing, you have less. Now this is brand new to most people because what is it you hear, especially when you're running levies? Well, there's just tons of money there. That is not true according to our own finance director at the Minnesota Department of Education. This is absolutely irrefutable. This is not, I think, I guess, I want. How did this happen? Well, this is also something else that is absolutely irrefutable. We had huge tax reforms in the 90s. Now, some of you may remember between 1995 and 2000, we were living in surplus land because we had the greatest surplus ever recorded in the state of Minnesota and ever recorded at the federal level. Those were our surplus years. And the decision made was to change the tax system to reflect that we were overtaxing. That was the decision. The other way to put that is give it back. So first and foremost, they reformed property taxes. Some of you may remember Jesse checks. Okay. They lowered taxes on commercial property. Commercial properties used to spend, were assessed 4 times what a house is. The intent of this was to have a house and a business taxed at the same rate. So if you had $1 million house or $1 million business, it would be taxed at the same rate. They found that they couldn't do that and make ends meet, so they had to end up taxing commercial property twice what a house is. But it still was 2 times or 2% less than it had been. That's what they did. And they took agriculture, farmland, and recreation land, cabins, off of the equation for school taxes. The people said, cabins, I'm only here on the weekend. Why should I have to pay for schools? Farms said, you know what, I have all this acreage. Why should I have to pay on all this acreage when I only live in the house and the acre that surrounds it? Well, no one really pushed back on the fact that the agriculture was actually also a business, but so that happened. So there was a deal cut there. Then they had the general education buy-down. There used to be a uniform tax rate on every piece of property in the state. That was collected, and that's what they used for most of their funding for schools. Not income taxes, not sales taxes, but at least half of it was done with property taxes since 1950. 1950 to 2001, that's what was used. Why? Because property doesn't tend to walk out of your state. Income can. Sales tax is absolutely dependent on the economy. But housing seems to be something that tends to stay within the parameters of a state. But everybody wanted a tax break on properties. So the state said, okay, we'll pick up all the school costs, and we're going to pay for it with everything we collect at the state, meaning income and sales. But we're going to give everybody a break and buy down that general ed levy. We're going to do away with it. We're going to repeal it. So most of us said, excuse me, what are you going to use instead? And they said, this was Jesse Ventura, he said, I think we should expand sales tax on services. Well, everybody loved the idea of the schools being paid for from the state, because everybody was tired of property taxes. But they didn't really want to expand taxes to services, especially at a time when what? We were living in surplus land. So what they said was, we'll pass half of the legislation. We'll do the buy-down, we'll repeal the general ed levy, and we will continue living in surplus land. We'll continue incomes going up. We'll continue sales tax going up. So some of us said, what happens if the state's economy tanks? We were laughed at. That won't happen. And we all knew that property values were just going to continue to go up. This didn't happen. So what we did at this time is we absolutely handcuffed school funding for the first time since 1950 to a state budget. If they got money through income, whatever, we were golden. They could return it to schools. But if they didn't, lo and behold, they didn't. So we didn't have money. So this is when you started seeing people say, well, you know what, the state pulls out dollars. So all that happened was we pushed it onto local property taxes. That's all we did. We did that with everything, cities, counties, and schools. So this is what happened. There had been $1.3 billion raised with this uniform general ed levy up to that point. They repealed it. It's $1.3 billion out of the state budget that had hitherto used for schools. Gone. Never to return to this day. So what happened? Well, that first year, remember, surplus land. So when the day happened that we had a brand new governor in 2003 walk into the Senate and say, wow, we've got a $4 billion deficit. How did that happen? Oh, pick me. Between the general ed levy, taking agriculture off and cabins off, and saying that we'll continue living the way we were, not going to happen. So the first year they turned around to that big bucket of surplus and paid it off for schools. Yay, 93%. Since then, look at the state's commitment. Why? Because they didn't have the money. But what did you see? You saw people trying to pass levies. But what ended up happening was, you should really be holding these local school boards, these local cities and counties, their feet to the fire. Because why are they doing this? They're getting tons from us. That's not true. It's simply not true. So what happened to the state budget? Well, I think this is important. In 2010, and I so apologize, I've got to change the colors on this. Anyway, you'll see the K-12 budget. By the way, this is the entire budget. Have you ever heard that K-12 is half of the state budget? Well, guess what? Not. If you take the entire state budget, it's half of the general fund. General fund is half of the state budget. So what does that make schools? That would be 25% of the state budget. Remember the only constitutional mandate. Okay, just wanted to point that out. So in 2012, 2010, 2011, 25% of the state's budget was spent on K-12. Still a substantial amount of dollars. Well, here it was in 2004 and 2005. That would be 28.6. Notice how the entire budget is moving. Notice the direction it's moving. The question that we believe should be asked is, how is the budget on this kind of a trend going to serve the state of Minnesota 5 years out, 10 years out, 20 years out? You'll see that Health and Human Service is pushing the K-12. Now, we're not saying take the money from HHS, because we know that, wow, you know, those kids, they don't really need HHS. Those families don't need HHS. HHS pays for these kids who are struggling for their medical expenses. It pays for kids who are really living in poverty for the basic issues. But the point is, the budget is shrinking and the percentage being given to schools is shrinking. That's the truth. What else is happening? Well, the state pays for special ed. This is just the state's portion of special ed. We all know that story about the federal, I hope. I just have to point it out. The federal government in 1970s, when they came up with IDEA 94-142, they said, all kids who are special ed need to be in schools. Got it. No problem. We understand that. And they said in the bill, we know it's going to cost states more. So for every dollar a state puts out in special ed, we will put in 40 cents. 40 cents. That was the deal. They've never paid more than 18. And in most places it's been 13 or 12, most times. Now, I have had several arguments with Congress about this, because they say you get this wrong. In the federal government, they actually put a bill together, and in that bill they authorize payment of a certain amount. But they don't appropriate it until it goes through the Appropriations Committee. So their argument is, we authorized it, get to that Appropriation Committee that just will never appropriate. All I know is the states are owed our children are owed $26 billion a year at this point going forward. Not my number, that's from Congressman Klein's number, who heads up workforce development at the national level. But the state said, we will pay this amount for special ed. It's a deal, it's in statute, 50% of a special ed staff, a certain amount for excess cost. It's all very, very well laid out. But what they do at the end of the year is they figure out how much money they have, and then they prorate what they told you you'd get. So this is the way it works. You put out $1 in special ed as a school district 1 year. The next year, you're expecting 68 cents, because that was the deal cut. 68 cents is what statute said. But actually, they don't have enough money. So instead, they're going to give you 72% of 68 cents of the dollar. So the money's gone. You already put that dollar out. So now you have your budget based on 68 cents, but now you're going to get 72% of 68 cents. And most people, this is where they glass over and go, are you kidding me? The point is $631 million is what they are in arrears. The state, not the feds, the state. I'd like to add 26 billion for 50 states, and that's me. At any rate, a really quick back of the envelope way to figure out what this all means is that we have about 1 million AMQs, your children, in the state. 631 million, divide it, $631 per kid, gone, missing in action. Okay? Again, this chart is from the Minnesota Department of Education. So the Minnesota Department of Education says, we're about $1,000 in arrears on the per pupil formula, and we also owe you about $631 per kid. So somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,500 to $2,000 per kid. Haven't quite figured out how to do this. So what that's done is this is the percentage of school budgets that are now have to go to pay for what the state isn't paying just in special ed, 12%. Now, an interesting number, and I really get not cautious about saying this, but a really interesting number is that 631 million. Because that 631 million is about the same dollar figure that is the average local levy in the state. So, what is it that the local levies are going to pay for? Now, I'm always nervous about saying that because that sounds like I don't think special education dollars should be out there. But the fact is that that's money that is supposed to be there for all of our children as well. Now, I'm also very nervous that there were some superintendents a couple of years ago that wanted to run a local levy just for special ed kids. Well, I was beside myself at how ludicrous that idea was. First off, talk about lying to your public. You have to pay for special ed. So what happens if that local levy fails? Oh, well, we were kidding? Plus, next year, maybe we should do a levy for blonde-haired, blue-eyed little girls under the age of 6. What are we doing about our funding? So this is, again, I put this up here because all of these things together are this chart. The formula, the 631 million, this is why we're running local levies. Now, in 2010, the Minnesota Management and Budget Office used this number. For cities, counties, and school districts, for every dollar that the state pulled out, 67 cents came back in local property tax. Now that's a really interesting thought. Meaning, cities and counties imposed the tax because they can. They imposed the tax because they found that the state had made a deal with them many, many years ago called local government aid. What they said is that, you know what, we're going to make sure that you can't, you can't assess much more than this in property tax. That's our job. But what we'll do is we'll make sure that we cut you all in with local government aid until the state ran out of money. Then what did you hear? What did you see? No local government aid. So cities and counties were like, we have to plow our roads. We have to take care of our police. We have to buy these things. So they assessed back in property tax. So people saw their property taxes going up. Schools had to ask for it. They had to go out for voter approval. But the same thing happened. So for every dollar the state took away, 67 cents came back in local property taxes. So what do you have? People are seeing their property taxes rise, and there's still a gap between the services you used to receive when the state paid $1 and the services you now receive when you're trying to make up the difference with 67 cents. So, less service, more money on your local tax bill. So, what are we? Levy dependent. No big surprise. Before 1990, 47% of schools had local levies in play. Today, it's over 90%. No surprise to anyone who's looking at the big picture. There's another thing about voter-approved referendum that you ought to know. First off, it's generated by local property taxes, which are different district to district. Its per levy dollar is based on property wealth of your district. Your property wealth is not just houses, it's houses, commercial, industrial, everything you have. That's used, and that determines a number. That's the property wealth of your area. Just like your house has a certain property wealth, if you took your house and business down the street and all of that and put it together, that would be property wealth. That's the formula that's used. And it's capped. You can't raise more than a certain number. All of these are actions done at the legislature. Then the legislature decided something else. Half of those levies before 1990 that they put in play, the deal was that you went ahead and if you got a levy passed, it was forever. If you did not want, as people, if you didn't want the levy, you'd vote out the board members who continued to use the levy. They didn't like that. So they said, we're going to sunset all levies. Meaning that no more than 10 years, but every 10 years you're going to be going out renewing an existing levy. Here's how it goes then. All right, so it's 2005. I put a levy in. I'm saying, you know what we're going to do? Because everybody does this. We're going to use these dollars to lower class size, to make sure that there's transportation there for kids, so that we have books. We all do that, right? Okay, then you run the levy. Success, not success, whatever, but there you go. So you try to be successful. 10 years goes down, and the state did not meet its commitment. So where have those dollars for that levy been used? Oh, that would be to make up for what the state pulled out. So now 10 years later, you're out saying, guess what? We need to renew that levy. And your voters have a very, very long memory. And they say, well, wasn't it supposed to be used to buy down class size and do this and do that? It was never used for that. And so what you say is, yeah, but that was based on if the state kept giving the 2% that they had, you lost the voter. So today, what you say is, we really need you to pass this levy. And people go, what do I get for it? And you say, less cuts. I don't think anybody finds that a particularly compelling argument, but it is the truth. They put caps on it, you could only raise so much, and then they moved the ballot question to general election day. School boards used to be elected in May, and all the ballot questions were always on the same day. The idea is you would focus on schools in May. They changed it because they said you're trying to fool the voter, because not all voters are watching in May for an election. This is what they did. So what's happened with referenda since that time? Okay, if you're sitting with a referenda less than $1,000 adjusted, not adjusted for inflation, your kids have less. It's really simple. This is a across the board piece that I think is really interesting. This blue line, and this is the state average, the blue line follows what the state has been given. The green line is all the local levies. So without the green line, I want you to notice how absolutely mirror image they are. If the green line weren't there, the red line, which is where school funding is now, would be here. This is below average. Now I have Osseo's on him, so if you give me half a second, I actually have every district. Now this is probably old data, because this is, I got this in 2010, 2011. But again, it's your dollars, the levy, your fund. I have every district around you. I have every district in the state. But this becomes a really interesting study when you look at it. So,
And the average is, you
1,000.
said it was below average, does that mean nationwide average?
No, this is just the state. This is
Okay.
just the state. This is what accounts for the Minnesota Department of Education telling you we have less money to spend in schools statewide than we had in 2003. Now, here's the thing I hear all the time. You know what? You should just work harder so that your community is behind your schools. Because the problem, the reason that you don't pass a levy, those people just don't really think your schools are doing the job they ought to do. Well, there's a little difference between willingness and capacity. Because remember that property wealth gig I told you about? If you have low property wealth in your school district, guess what? It costs you more to get the same dollar than a school district that has high property wealth. So not only is tax fairness an issue here, but it plays out in your local school. Now, we have this uneven levies right now, but I've got Osseo down here, okay? It costs the average homeowner per $100,000, $260 to get that $1,235. Okay, do we understand that? It costs you $260 per $100,000 in your home to get that. Let's see what that buys you in other districts, okay? Let's start out with these. $225 in Minnetonka gets you $1,860 per kid. $166 in Hopkins gets you $1,755. Wayzata, $188 gets you $1,605. Orono, $125 gets you $1,605. Now, the lowest to the highest there, $600. Walk into any classroom you have, count the kids, 35, 40, times 600. Tell me how much more each classroom would have. This is based not on your willingness, but on the capacity to raise the dollars. Let's look at other places though. 147 in Elk River only nets you $698. 103 in Buffalo only nets you $490. So we may feel poor here, but take a look. Anoka, $292 to get $1,232. See that disequity? Not only the disequity in the dollar you have, but the disequity in how much capacity, how much you have to put in order to get the same dollar. So if we are going to be reliant on local levies, if that's going to be the deal, first off, let's be honest about it. And secondly, let's make sure that we have some structure to try and equalize these. Yes?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure I follow that
No,
property
I'm
well.
not either.
Just do a
Yeah,
little.
Okay.
Just the math.
All right.
How is that?
All right, let's do it this way. I have property wealth in a district, okay? I've got some business, I've got some houses, I've got that. I add it all up and it comes up to a number, $486,000 is the average property wealth of your district. Based on that, then each home has to pay a certain amount per $100,000 in their value in order to get that number for your school. So if your local levy is $1,232 and you're in Anoka, if you're a homeowner and your house is $200,000, you have to pay $292 times
That's
two.
$1,232 per pupil,
Yes.
is it not?
Right.
Yes.
I think that's the confusion.
Oh.
So $292, if my house is a $100,000 house, I pay $292 in additional property taxes. If everybody does that in Anoka, it gets me $1,232 per pupil across my district.
Correct. But if you are Orono, you pay $125 per $100,000 in order, and you raise $1,600 per child.
Because of the difference in the property wealth.
Yes,
They
Yes,
have larger homes or whatever more, so it's
more commercial
600,000
and
or
industrial,
whatever.
right. Now,
But that homeowner in Orono is paying significantly more because his house or her house is worth significantly more.
no,
Or is it, am I
No,
missing?
less per thousand.
no.
no, but you're saying per house because the houses are worth more. So our average housing value
No.
might be $150.
No.
This is per.
But that's per $100,000 in your home. So if you have a $500,000 house, this is 260 times 5.
Right. But the-
So
but the
that's
same
what
house in
That's what
Orono-
he was
the same house in
saying.
Orono is $1 million,
right?
so proportion.
But that, no, because the $1 million house in Orono, they pay 125 times 10.
Okay.
Yes, that's what he's, yes.
Yeah.
So, no, but it's not really, it's not the housing.
But per capita. our
It's
neighbor-
not per capita.
They get the 125 again based on, let's say, Orono's $1 million property value,
Yes,
and Osseo or whatever, another district's 500,000. So that the one, if they have $1 million worth, so their per house, per 100,000 is going down.
right.
Because
I will
they have
show
more
you,
As a
overall wealth.
percent.
I will show you how this is done. This is the actual formula. So, if you have your district's, you really wanted this, your district's referendum market value per student, that's the 1,232, divided by how much property wealth you have in your district, nets how much each homeowner has to pay per certain amount. Does that make sense?
Where does the 476 come from?
That is all legislated. And it was legislated, and in 1993, I'm sorry, she said, where did that $486,000 come from? In 1993, the state took all the property wealth in all the districts in the state. They came up with the average property wealth in the district. If you were above, in the state, if you were above that, you didn't get any equalization aid from the state to help you with the tax fairness issue. If you were below that, you got some money from the state aid, to help you so that you didn't have to put out so much for the same dollar figure. The problem is, they kept that number in 1993 and never inflated it. So right now, the average property wealth in our state is significantly higher, so very few districts actually qualify for some aid from the state to relieve their tax burden. So you're trying to ask your taxpayers to pay significantly more for less dollars than a neighboring district.
And that per pupil cost that we saw before, that is based on the formula that you showed us at the beginning? That arch, whatever, 1242 for Osseo, that,
Now that's a local levy, and a local levy is on top of the formula.
gotcha.
Okay? So we had the Minnesota Miracle. The Minnesota Miracle said no matter where you are, we will make sure that through tax fairness and the dollars we give you, that you have equal access to dollars for schools. But now, I argue that it's every district for itself. And it's every district for itself based on an unfair taxing system. If you've not looked at Schools for Equity and Education and you are members of Schools for Equity and Education, the front page of their does a great little video about this, about somebody coming in and buying a pizza for $10. The next person comes up and they're from a lower property wealth district. And they're asked to pay $12 or $15 for the same pizza. It's a great video. That explains equalization. And the state used to pick up some of that difference for buying the pizza. So you go in and the first person gives you $10. Then you could go in and it would be $12 for you, but the state might pick up $1.50 of it. Okay? Now, I'm not doing this to say, well, it's those other districts. I'm doing this to tell you, if we're going to be reliant, then we have to make sure that we have a way so that the taxpayers have equal capacity, not just willingness, to have schools funded in their district. Does that make sense? Okay. This is the trend, and this explains what I was mentioning. In Minneapolis and St. Paul in 2003, the revenue that they would get, the levy, is $237. 13% of it was picked up by the state in equalization aid. Okay? Now, in non-metro, you could get a levy of $137 and 65% of it would be state aid. Okay? Because the state was nodding to the fact that they were trying to do property tax fairness. But notice what's happened. The main reason is they never took that average property wealth in the state and married it to anything. So we all know what's happened to property values in, 1993 to 2013? It's really gone up. So what the state has also been able to renege on is that. So today, let's take you. Well, let's take an outer rate. You maybe had $457, 16% of it would have been able to be paid for by the state to help you buy this. Today, it's a little under 2%. So that cost is absolutely borne on you. This is why passing levies between districts becomes such a nightmare. This is why the issue of that whole, you gotta go every 10 years and renew them, becomes a nightmare. Because no matter where you are, you can open your Metro paper and find somebody who's looking for money. It has given the impression to the public that schools have this insatiable desire for money. The truth is that the state is reneging day after day, year after year, on paying A, what they said they'd pay with special ed, and B, what they are paying on the per pupil formula, and C, making it possible for local property taxpayers to have an equal shot. On top of all of that, and this goes with the state budget, in the 1990s, we were paying 17% of all of our personal income, specifically for services in the state, for roads, for bridges. I shouldn't say that. Roads and bridges are usually paid through transportation. For all our parks, our recreation, our state parks. And you'll notice it did bump up to 17.9 in 1993 and 17. Remember those years? We had collected those years. We were in surplus. Should there have been some dealing with that? More than likely. But look what ended up happening. They gave it back to such an extent that it's now 15.4. Each penny, each percentage on this, each percentage is $2 billion to the state's budget. $2 billion. So this year, you drop almost $2 billion. The next year, you're 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 $2 billion. The next year. It's cumulative. So the state budget, even though they've got to add more things to it, has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. There's been no inflation in our state budget since a lot of this action took place, 2003. They don't factor inflation in when they figure expenditures. They do factor it in when they figure revenues. So it would be like you looking at your balance at home and say, well, I think I'm going to get an increase next year on my salary. They told me I'm going to get 2%. But you know what? I know nothing's going to go up. There's going to be no gas prices. There's going to be no price in heating oil. There's going to be absolutely no price in food. There's nothing. That's the way the state balances its budget. That and deciding to use school dollars to do it. And then this is individual, just for education. We used to pay as much as 5 cents out of every dollar just for education. Today it's 4, and it's trending down. Now, I didn't add any of the slides that I usually put on here about how we have more and more kids in greater need. High amounts of autism, high amounts not just in numbers of special ed, but the depth of the need they have. The amount of poverty. Do you know today in Minnesota, 37% of our K-12 kids live in poverty. 37%. And it is trending more because 50% of kids under the age of 5 live in poverty in Minnesota. That means this trend is continuing. It's not going to stop. And if you believe that kids who are living in poverty have the same level when they come to school and have that capability of learning exactly like their affluent cohort, I have a whole bunch of slides to show you. So what we do around this, and I'm really glad that Laura talked originally about having the LAC, because we're not happy with local levies. I have played with the idea, don't know if I have the strength, played with the idea of asking parents from one end of the state to the other saying, we're not running local levies anymore. You know why? Because we're kind of tired of doing your job. Obviously, superintendents are not happy with me when I say that, because we also have this belief, and Parents United's tagline, childhood has no rewind. We get it. These dollars have to be dealt with as we're fighting the state. So having a legislative network helps us all fight at the state for these fairness issues. But meanwhile, we understand how difficult it is to pass local levies. So we also help folks there. So we work with parents and foundations and educators and media around the state, drawing attention to the impact of this, trying to explain this to them. We keep a website that's really current with articles, events, and Capitol hearing schedules. If you ever want to go and see something at the Capitol, meet me. I'm there every day. We build relationships with the governor's office and the MDE, majority and minority leaderships. We collaborate with other education advocacy groups to learn as much as we can, and also to make the parent voice valid in those conversations. And then during session, which runs January to May, we monitor every education committee. We track and analyze all the proposed legislation. We provide this information in weekly emails during the session to people in 134 legislative districts. And we just believe that somebody has to do something. It's just incredibly pathetic that it has to be us.